Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. Fear doesn't always show up as danger. Sometimes it shows up as offense, as the feeling that something is being done to you, that someone or something has aimed straight at your life and decided to make it harder. It was late evening in a grocery store parking lot, the kind with tall lights that buzz softly and leave long shadows between cars. A person sat in their vehicle with the engine off, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. Groceries still in the trunk because they weren't ready to go home yet. The store doors slid open and closed in the distance. A shopping cart rattled across the pavement, pushed by the wind more than by anyone's intention. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. Nothing unusual, and yet their chest felt tight. Earlier that day, something small had happened. Not a crisis, not a disaster, just a moment that landed wrong, a comment that felt dismissive, a delay that felt personal, a situation that made their mind say, "Of course this would happen to me." That thought had stuck. It replayed itself in different forms as the day went on. Why does this always happen? Why does it feel like I'm constantly bracing for impact, sitting there now? The parking lot felt strangely symbolic. Cars pulling in and out, people crossing paths without acknowledging one another, everyone moving according to their own needs, their own timelines. Still, the feeling remained. I've been hit. They leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly. The windows had fogged slightly from their breath, softening the harsh white lights outside. For a moment, the world looked gentler through the glass. They remembered a story they'd once heard long ago without paying much attention to it at the time. A simple image. A boat drifting down a river. If a boat crashes into you and no one is inside it, you don't get angry. There's no one to blame. No intention to react to. Just contact. Just movement meeting movement. But if you believe someone is steering it, if you imagine a person aiming straight at you, then anger rises instantly. Fear follows close behind. They sat with that image for a moment. What if some of what feels personal isn't? The thought didn't excuse anything. It didn't deny discomfort. It simply questioned the story being told around it. A cart rolled by again, bumping lightly into the curb. The sound was dull, harmless. No one jumped. No one reacted. They noticed how quickly the mind assigns meaning, how fast it fills in intent, how rarely it pauses to ask whether there's actually a driver behind the collision. Fear loves to personalize randomness. It whispers, "This is about you. You're being targeted. You should stay guarded." Those thoughts feel protective. They feel like awareness. But often, they just keep the body tense, waiting for the next imagined impact. The person reached for a receipt on the passenger seat, folded it absent-mindedly, then unfolded it again. A small repetitive motion, something grounding. The paper was thin, warm from the store reel in their hands. They thought about how many times they'd carried resentment longer than necessary. How often fear had disguised itself as vigilance. How exhausting it was to feel constantly braced. What if the boat is empty? Not everything that collides with you is aimed. Not every disruption carries intention. Not every delay is a message. Outside, a couple walked past, talking quietly, heads close together. Their laughter drifted briefly, then faded. Another car pulled out, tires hissing softly on the pavement. Life moving, crossing, bumping, passing. They felt something loosen just slightly. The tightness didn't disappear, but it shifted. The story around it softened. They weren't suddenly okay with everything that had happened, but they weren't gripping it as tightly either. The empty boat image stayed with them. Fear had been telling them they were under attack. Understanding suggested something simpler. Movement happens. They rested their head back against the seat and closed their eyes for a few seconds. Just enough to notice their breath. In, out. Nothing fancy. Just confirming that right now nothing else was required. When they opened their eyes again, the parking lot looked the same. Lights buzzing, carts rattling, cars idling. But the feeling inside had changed its posture. Not defensive, just present. They turned the key in the ignition. The engine started smoothly, a familiar sound, reliable. As they pulled out of the parking space, they didn't replay the moment from earlier again. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer demanded immediate interpretation. Some things collide and move on. Some boats drift without anyone steering them, and knowing the difference changes how tightly you hold the oars. The car eased out of the parking lot and onto the street, tires rolling over pavement, still warm from the day. The radio stayed off. The silence felt intentional now, not empty. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, lighting the inside of the car for a second at a time before letting it go dark again. The moment from earlier tried to return the way these things do. A sentence replayed, a look that felt dismissive, the old familiar tightening ready to defend. But something was different this time. The image of the empty boat stayed in front of it like a filter. The thought arrived, but it didn't land the same way. Instead of spiraling into, "Why does this always happen?" the mind paused on a simpler question. Was anyone steering? They noticed how often fear assumes intention, how quickly it fills the gap between event and emotion with a story about being targeted, overlooked, or attacked. That story feels urgent, protective, necessary. But stories have weight. They require energy to carry. And once you're carrying them, everything feels heavier. They stopped at a red light. The car idled quietly. Somewhere to the right, music thumped faintly from another vehicle. A different rhythm, a different evening intersecting with theirs for a moment and then moving on. The light changed. They continued. Life, they realized, is full of contact without coordination. People brushing past each other's days, each carrying their own worries, their own momentum. Collisions happen not because of malice, but because paths cross. That understanding didn't erase hurt. It just made it smaller, more proportional, easier to set down. They thought about how often fear had turned inconvenience into insult, delay into rejection, neutral silence into judgment, and how exhausting that had been. The road curved gently through a residential area. Houses stood close together, lights on in some windows, off in others. Curtains drawn. Dogs barking briefly, then quieting again. They passed a stop sign and slowed almost automatically. The body knows these patterns well. It doesn't question every instruction. It trusts the flow of movement it has learned. What if the mind could do that too? Trust that not every jolt requires a story. Trust that not every bump needs a conclusion. They turned onto their street. The familiar trees arched overhead, leaves catching the glow of the lamps. The neighborhood felt unchanged, steady, uninterested in the drama of the day. They parked and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deep, but not heavy. The kind of silence that lets thoughts finish themselves. Sitting there, they noticed the absence of something. The constant bracing had eased. The readiness to react had softened. Fear hadn't vanished. It rarely does. But it had lost its sharp edge. Without the story of intention, it didn't know where to stand. They gathered their things and stepped out of the car. Cool air met their face. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked on spraying water in a slow, predictable arc. An empty motion. No message. Just function. They walked toward the house, groceries still waiting in the trunk. That could be dealt with later. Tonight didn't need to be efficient. As they unlocked the door, the thought returned one last time, quieter now. Maybe not everything is about you. Maybe that's not a loss. Inside the house greeted them with stillness. No urgency, no demands, just space. They set their keys down and took a breath, feeling the day release its grip. The empty boat drifted on, carrying nothing that needed to be carried. And for the first time in a while, they let it pass without reaching for the oars. Fear doesn't always push you to run. Sometimes it convinces you to stay, to hold still, to call discomfort safety simply because it's familiar. It was early evening, the kind of time when the sky hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. A person sat alone in a small living room. Lights dimmed low, the TV on, but muted. Images moved across the screen without sound, faces talking, laughing, reacting to things that didn't reach the room. The air felt warm, too warm. At first they hadn't noticed it. The heater had been on earlier and the house tended to hold warmth longer than expected. But now, sitting still, they could feel it pressing in. The kind of warmth that doesn't comfort. The kind that makes you restless without explaining why. They shifted on the couch and glanced toward the thermostat. The number was higher than they remembered setting it. They considered getting up to adjust it, then didn't. It's fine, they told themselves. I'll deal with it later. That phrase had been showing up a lot lately. Life had settled into a pattern that looked stable from the outside. Same routines, same conversations, same expectations. Nothing was technically wrong. And yet something underneath felt strained, like a structure being asked to hold more than it was built for. Fear had an opinion about this. Fear said, "Don't disrupt things." Fear said, "At least you know what this is." Fear said leaving would be worse. So they stayed, on the couch, in the routine, in the version of life that felt safe mostly because it hadn't collapsed yet. The room grew warmer. They noticed a faint smell, then not smoke, not exactly, just something stale. Heated air carrying the scent of old dust from the vents. Ordinary, explainable. Still, it made their chest tighten. They muted the TV completely and listened. The house made its usual sounds, the low hum of the heater, the refrigerator clicking on pipes, shifting faintly in the walls. All normal, and yet the body didn't relax. Fear often works this way. It points to familiarity and calls it protection, even when the conditions have quietly changed. They stood up at last and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the street looked calm. A neighbor walked a dog. Porch lights flicked on one by one. No alarms, no visible danger. Everything looked fine. Inside, the heat lingered. They thought about how many times they'd ignored discomfort because it didn't come with flashing lights or clear warnings. How often they'd told themselves that unease wasn't enough of a reason to move. You need a better excuse, fear would say. You need proof. You need certainty. They placed a hand against the wall. It felt warm. Warmer than it should have. That caught their attention. They followed the warmth down the hallway, past closed doors, toward the laundry room where the heater was housed. The hum grew louder as they approached, not alarming, just persistent. They opened the door. A wave of heat met them immediately. Not fire, not flames, just an enclosed space holding too much warmth for too long. The heater was working harder than it needed to, cycling without pause. It wasn't an emergency, but it wasn't nothing. They turned the dial down and opened a small window nearby. Cool air rushed in, sharp and relieving. The temperature began to shift almost immediately. Standing there, they felt something loosen inside their chest. Relief didn't come from fixing a crisis. It came from acknowledging reality. They realized then how close this felt to something else. How often they'd stayed in situations that were slowly draining them because nothing had caught fire yet. Jobs, roles, expectations, versions of themselves they kept alive long after they'd stopped being livable. Fear had convinced them that leaving required catastrophe. But what if it doesn't? What if recognizing the heat is enough? They stood in the laundry room for a moment longer, breathing in the cooler air. The house began to sound different as the heater quieted. Less strain, less urgency. They thought about how fear frames departure as failure, as quitting, as weakness. But sometimes staying is what burns you. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't enduring the heat. It's stepping out of it. They closed the door gently and returned to the living room. The space already felt more breathable. The couch no longer held the same weight. They sat down again, noticing how different it felt to be there by choice rather than obligation. Fear hadn't disappeared. It hovered nearby, uncertain now. Its argument weakened by the simple fact that nothing terrible had happened when they acted. The house wasn't ruined. The world hadn't ended. They were safer now than they had been before. And that mattered. They leaned back and exhaled, the warmth slowly receding. The thoughts settled quietly without drama. Some places feel safe only because you haven't left them yet. That doesn't mean they aren't burning you. The change in temperature was subtle at first. Not the kind you notice all at once, but the kind your body registers before your thoughts catch up. The air felt lighter, easier to pull in. The room no longer pressed back. They stayed seated, hands resting on their thighs, letting the house recalibrate around them. The heater cycled off. Silence filled the gap it left, wide and unfamiliar. It wasn't empty. It was relieved. Fear didn't like that silence. It arrived quietly, trying a different approach. You overreacted. It wasn't that bad. You could have handled it longer. Fear is clever that way. When it can't stop you from moving, it tries to rewrite what just happened. It minimizes discomfort after the fact, as if endurance were the measure of wisdom. They noticed the thought without chasing it. The room told a different story. The walls felt neutral now. The couch no longer held that restless warmth. The body, which had been subtly tense for hours, softened without being instructed to do so. Bodies don't argue with relief. They recognize it immediately. They leaned back and closed their eyes for a moment. The TV screen continued flickering silently, light shifting across the room in slow patterns. A show continued without them. The world went on. They thought about how often they'd been taught to ignore signals like this, to push through discomfort, to call it discipline, to believe that leaving meant something had gone wrong. But nothing had gone wrong tonight. They hadn't failed. They hadn't caused a scene. They hadn't burned anything down. They had simply opened a window. That realization felt bigger than the room. So many situations in life don't collapse dramatically. They overheat quietly, slowly. The danger isn't sudden loss, it's prolonged exposure. Staying in places that ask too much for too long. Calling it stability because it hasn't exploded yet. Fear keeps people inside those spaces by offering a false choice: stay and suffer, or leave and regret it forever. But there's a third option fear rarely mentions. Adjust, step out, change the conditions. They stood up and walked through the house again, this time noticing details they'd ignored earlier. The way the hallway felt cooler now. The way their shoulders weren't drawn up around their ears. The way each breath landed more fully in the chest. None of that required courage in the dramatic sense. It required honesty. They paused by the open window in the laundry room. Cold air still streamed in, steady and unapologetic. Outside, the night smelled clean, distant, open. They rested a hand on the sill and stayed there. Fear hovered nearby, uncertain now without its usual authority. It couldn't argue with what the body already knew. It could only suggest going back, turning the dial up again, returning to what was familiar. But familiar isn't always safe. And safe isn't always kind. They closed the window part way, leaving it cracked just enough. Balance, not too cold, not too warm. The house didn't need extremes to be livable. That felt important too. They returned to the living room and turned the TV off completely. The sudden quiet was deeper now, more complete. The house had settled into itself. They sat again, this time without the urge to escape their own skin. The space felt like somewhere they could stay for a while. Fear hadn't vanished. It probably wouldn't. But it had lost its strongest argument that staying was the only way to remain intact. Sometimes the most dangerous place is the one you keep calling home long after it stops being habitable. And sometimes the safest move isn't running towards something new. It's simply stepping out of what's been slowly burning you. They stayed there as the night deepened, breathing evenly, letting the house hold its new temperature. Nothing dramatic followed. No consequences arrived. No alarms sounded. Just a quieter room, a steadier body, and the understanding that safety isn't about endurance. It's about knowing when to leave the heat. Fear is often described as something to get rid of, something to calm, control, or lock away so it doesn't cause damage. But some fears don't quiet down when you try to restrain them. They push back harder. They kick, they pull. They exhaust you until you're too tired to stay balanced. It was late evening, the hour when the neighborhood softened. Porch lights were on, but not bright. The street was quiet enough that footsteps carried farther than usual. A person walked slowly along the sidewalk, jacket zipped halfway, hands tucked into pockets, more out of habit than cold. They hadn't planned to go for a walk. The idea came after pacing the living room one too many times, picking up a phone and setting it down again, feeling that restless pressure that doesn't point to any specific problem, just a need to move. Their breath was a little shallow at first, not panicked, just alert, as if the body was braced for something it couldn't name. Fear had been like that lately. Not dramatic, not sharp, more like a constant pull on the reins, a sense that if they didn't stay vigilant, something would run off course. They passed houses that all looked similar in the low light. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly, windows glowing with other people's evenings. Ordinary scenes that somehow made their own inner tension stand out more clearly. Fear has a way of doing that. It makes normal life feel like something you're failing to keep up with. They tighten their grip on the phone in their pocket, thumb brushing the screen without taking it out. A familiar urge surfaced to check something. Messages, news, anything that might explain or justify this feeling. They resisted, not as a discipline, but because they already knew it wouldn't help. The sidewalk dipped slightly as it curved around a corner. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Leaves scraped along the pavement in a thin line pushed by a light breeze. The body started to settle into the rhythm of walking. Step, shift, step. The mind followed more slowly, still scanning, still tense. Fear spoke up as it tends to do when things get quiet. You should be more careful. You should be prepared. You don't know what's coming. It sounded reasonable. It always does. They thought about how much energy had gone into trying to control that voice. Deep breathing, distraction, positive thinking. Sometimes it worked for a while. Sometimes it didn't. Fear isn't impressed by force. It just digs in. They stopped briefly at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, even though there were no cars coming. The red hand glowed steadily. They stood still, weight shifting from one foot to the other. Across the street, a small park opened up, mostly dark. A single lamppost illuminated a patch of grass, the rest fading into shadow. They remembered something they'd once heard, a simple image that hadn't meant much at the time. A wild horse. Strong, fast, unpredictable. If you try to lock a wild horse in a small pen, it doesn't become calm. It becomes dangerous. It panics. It breaks itself trying to escape. But if you learn how to ride it, if you move with its energy instead of against it, something else becomes possible. The image stayed. They crossed the street and walked along the edge of the park, staying where the light still reached. Their pace picked up slightly, not rushed, just more decisive. The body responded immediately, breath-deepening arms swinging more freely. Fear shifted too. It didn't disappear. It changed texture, less tight, more like energy than threat. They noticed how the body didn't actually want fear gone. It wanted it directed, used, given somewhere to go. The thought surprised them. What if fear isn't the enemy? What if it's just untrained power? They walked faster for a block, then slowed again. Tested the pace. The feeling inside adjusted accordingly. When they moved, fear felt like momentum. When they stopped, it pooled and pressed. That was new information. They had been trying to suppress fear to quiet it completely. But maybe fear isn't meant to be silenced. Maybe it's meant to be guided. The park ended, giving way to another residential stretch. The streetlights here were spaced farther apart, leaving pockets of darkness between them. They didn't feel unsafe, just aware. Fear flared briefly in those darker gaps, then settled again when the next light appeared. They realized then how much fear depends on stillness without support. When there's no movement, no rhythm, the mind fills the space with imagined threats. Movement changes the conversation. They slowed their walk, letting the body find a comfortable pace again. The tension that had driven them out of the house had eased, not because it was conquered, but because it was being carried differently. Fear walked with them now, not dragging them. They reached the end of the block and paused, looking down a long stretch of road that disappeared into shadow. Fear stirred. They didn't turn back. They took a step forward, steady, unforced, letting the momentum continue. The wild horse was still there. But for the first time, it wasn't running away with them. They kept walking, letting the night set the pace instead of their thoughts. The street stretched out ahead, quiet and unremarkable, and that ordinariness felt grounding. No decisions needed to be made out here. No conclusions reached. Just forward motion. The fear was still present, but it had stopped pulling so hard. It moved more like a current, now noticeable, alive, but no longer knocking them off balance. The body adjusted to it naturally, the way you adjust when you learn how a bicycle leans into a turn. They noticed how often fear spikes when there's nowhere for it to go. When you're sitting still, staring at the same walls, replaying the same questions, fear builds pressure in closed spaces. Out here, it had room. They passed a driveway where a sprinkler clicked on spraying water in a slow arc. The sound was rhythmic, almost soothing. Mist caught the light briefly, then vanished. Another small reminder that movement doesn't have to be forceful to be effective. The thought returned clearer. Now a fear isn't asking to be erased. It's asking to be handled. They had spent so much time trying to calm themselves down, to convince their body there was nothing to worry about. But the body hadn't needed convincing. It had needed direction. Fear, like a wild horse, carries strength, alertness, speed. It notices things before logic does. But without guidance, it runs in circles, burning energy without going anywhere. As they walked, their breath synced more evenly with their steps. Inhale for 2, exhale for 3. Not as a technique, just something that happened. The nervous system settling into a pattern it recognized. They felt warmer now, not from exertion, but from circulation. The cold night air no longer felt sharp. It felt clean. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A time when fear had actually helped them, kept them attentive, responsive, alive. A moment when quick instinct had prevented a mistake or guided them away from something that didn't feel right. Fear hadn't always been a problem. It had only become one when it took the reins completely. They slowed again, near another intersection, waiting for a car to pass before crossing. The headlights swept by, briefly illuminating everything, then disappeared. Darkness returned softer this time. They crossed without rushing. What had changed wasn't the environment. It was their relationship to the feeling moving through them. They weren't trying to outrun fear anymore. They weren't trying to trap it either. They were letting it move, letting it spend its energy in a way that didn't turn inward, that felt like trust, not blind trust in the future or in outcomes they couldn't control. Just trust in their ability to stay upright while things moved. They reached the edge of the neighborhood and turned back toward home. The idea of going inside no longer felt claustrophobic. It felt like a place to rest, not a place to pace. As they walked back, the fear continued to quiet, not disappearing, just settling into the background, like a horse finally matched to the rhythm of the rider. They realized then how often fear becomes overwhelming. Not because it's too strong, but because it's misunderstood. Treated as a threat instead of a signal. Fought instead of guided. You don't break a wild horse by force. You meet it. You move with it. You learn its language. The house came back into view, porch light glowing softly. Familiar. Steady. The walk had changed nothing externally. No problem solved. No plans made. And yet the body felt different. They stepped up onto the porch and paused before going inside, breathing in the cool air one last time. Fear was still there, quiet and alert, like an animal at rest. That was okay. They opened the door and went in the warmth of the house, meeting them gently. The urge to pace was gone. The need to check the phone had faded. Fear had been given something to do. And tonight, that was enough. The wild horse hadn't been tamed. It had been understood. And in that understanding, balance returned. They had always thought of forgiveness as something that happened between people. A conversation, an apology. A moment where someone finally understood what they had done. Without that, forgiveness felt incomplete, almost dishonest. But tonight, no one else was here. They were standing in the hallway of their apartment, lights, low shoes, still on coat, not yet hung up. The day had followed them home the way it sometimes did, slipping inside before they could shut the door. The air felt heavy, like the space had been waiting for their mood. On the small table by the wall sat a bowl with keys in it. House keys, car keys, a spare key they'd never gotten around to returning. Metal touching metal. A quiet, familiar sound when they dropped their own keys in and heard them settle. They paused there longer than necessary, fingers still resting on the edge of the bowl. Earlier, something had happened that reopened an old anger. Not a new wound, an old one. The kind you think has healed until something brushes against it the wrong way. A comment, a look, a reminder that some people never acknowledge the damage they cause. The anger hadn't exploded. It had locked in. Now it sat inside them like a closed door. Solid, unmoving. Keeping something in, or maybe keeping something out. They couldn't quite tell anymore. They kicked off their shoes and walked into the living room without turning on the overhead light. Just the small lamp by the couch. The room felt narrow tonight, like the walls were closer than usual. Not because the space had changed, but because they were carrying something bulky inside. They sat down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Their jaw was tight, their breath shallow. It felt like being stuck in a place with no windows. They thought about the person they were angry with, not vividly, just the outline, the shape of the problem, the history that didn't need to be replayed in detail to still hurt. They noticed how often their mind returned to the same question. When will they finally admit it? When will they see what they did? When will they take responsibility? When will they say the words that would make all of this easier to carry? The answer, quietly and honestly, was one they didn't like. Maybe never. That thought landed heavier than the anger itself. They sat up and rubbed their face with both hands, palms pressing into tired eyes. It felt unfair, like losing twice. First the harm, then the silence afterward. Their gaze drifted back to the hallway table, to the bowl of keys. They stood, walked over, and picked up the spare key, the one that didn't really belong to anything anymore. They turned it between their fingers, feeling its weight. It struck them then how strange keys are. So small, so ordinary. And yet, they decide where you can go, what stays locked, what opens, what you're allowed to leave behind. They'd been holding on to this anger like a key, or maybe like a lock. It had felt protective at first. As long as they stayed angry, they didn't have to risk being hurt again. As long as the door stayed closed, nothing unexpected could get in. But standing there now, they realized something uncomfortable. They were also locked inside. The anger hadn't just kept the other person out. It had narrowed their own world, made everything feel heavier, smaller, like living in a room where the door never opened, even for fresh air. They hadn't noticed how long they'd been living that way. They sat back down, the spare key resting in their palm. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room. A normal sound. A grounding sound. They didn't feel generous. They didn't feel forgiving. They still felt wronged. Still felt justified. But another feeling had joined those: exhaustion. They were tired of carrying this. Tired of replaying conversations that would never finish. Tired of waiting for someone else to hand them peace. They looked at the key again. Not as a symbol, just as an object. Something that could turn one way or the other. What if forgiveness wasn't about opening the door for the other person? What if it was about unlocking the door from the inside? That thought didn't bring relief right away. It brought resistance, skepticism, a tight pull in the chest that said, if I let this go, they win. But sitting with it longer, they saw that no one was winning right now. Everyone had already moved on, except them. The door had stayed closed long after the danger had passed. They didn't turn the key yet. They didn't have to. Just holding it was enough for tonight. They placed it back in the bowl, gently, as if it were something fragile. The metal clink sounded softer than before. The room didn't magically expand. The anger didn't disappear. But the air felt a little less stale. They stood there for a moment, breathing, not making any promises. Just noticing that the door inside them didn't have to stay locked forever. They didn't expect anything dramatic to happen next. No sudden release. No wave of compassion. The anger was still there when they woke up the following morning, sitting in the body, the same way a locked muscle sits, quiet but restrictive. The apartment looked ordinary in the daylight. The hallway table, the bowl of keys, the door that opened and closed like it always had. Nothing about the space suggested imprisonment. And yet they could still feel it. that inner narrowing, that sense of being stuck in a conversation that never ended. Later that day, they went out to run errands, grocery store, pharmacy. A short walk around the block, normal life moving at a normal pace. But every so often the old thought returned, slipping in between tasks like it had a right to be there. They should have known better. They never took responsibility. They got away with it. Each thought landed with the same familiar weight. Each one tightened the same place in the chest. It was clear now this wasn't about remembering. It was about holding. Back home, they set the grocery bags on the counter and paused again by the hallway table. The bowl of keys hadn't moved. The spare key still rested on top, slightly apart from the others. They picked it up again. This time they noticed something new. The key wasn't sharp. It wasn't heavy. It didn't demand anything. It was just a piece of metal shaped to fit one lock in the world. And right now, it wasn't even attached to anything useful. They turned it over in their palm and thought about how long they'd been waiting. Waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting for an apology that would make the past make sense. Waiting for the other person to finally unlock something for them. But the truth was quiet and uncomfortable. That person wasn't holding the key anymore. Maybe they never were. The lock was here, inside. They sat down on the couch, key still in hand, and let that sink in. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't a door that swung open to let someone back in. It was a door that opened inward, just enough to let air move again. They didn't have to invite anyone through it. They closed their eyes and felt the anger directly without building a story around it. Just the sensation, the tightness, the heat, the familiar edge. It wasn't endless. It had a shape. And like most things with a shape, it could change. They imagined the door not in detail, not as a metaphor to analyze, just as a presence. Solid, closed, familiar. And then they imagined the smallest possible movement, not flinging it open, just loosening the latch. There was resistance, a reflexive fear. If I open this, I lose my protection. But another voice, quieter and steadier, answered back. You're not being protected anymore. You're being confined. They let that thought sit without arguing with it. When they opened their eyes, nothing in the room had changed. The groceries still waited to be put away. The afternoon light slanted across the floor. The world hadn't shifted to accommodate this moment. But inside, something had eased, not in a way that felt emotional, but in a way that felt practical. Like setting down a bag you'd forgotten you were carrying. They stood, walked to the hallway table, and placed the spare key back in the bowl. Not carefully this time, just normally. The sound it made was unremarkable. And that was the point. They weren't performing forgiveness. They weren't declaring it. They weren't forgiving for anyone else. They were simply choosing not to keep themselves locked in the same small room. The anger didn't vanish. It didn't need to. It just stopped deciding everything. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed and the apartment grew quiet again, they noticed how different the space felt. Not brighter, not happier, just less tight. Like the walls had shifted back to where they belonged. They thought briefly about the person they'd been angry with. Not with warmth, not with bitterness either. Just acknowledgement. This happened. It hurt. And I don't need to carry it forever. That was enough. They turned off the lights one by one and let the apartment settle into darkness. The door inside them wasn't wide open. It didn't have to be. It was unlocked. And that was already a kind of freedom. She noticed the knot in the cord before she noticed her mood. It was a phone charger pulled out of her bag and dropped onto the kitchen counter without looking. When she reached for it again, the cord came up in a tight, ugly twist loops folded into each other, one end trapped somewhere in the middle. The kind of tangle that makes you sigh before you even touch it. Her first instinct was immediate. She tugged. The cord resisted, stiff and uncooperative. She pulled harder the way she always did when something didn't move fast enough. The knot tightened. One loop cinched down on another smaller, now more stubborn. She felt irritation rise in her chest, quick and familiar. Not because of the charger. The charger was just convenient. It had been building all day. Earlier, there had been a disagreement. Not loud, not dramatic, just tense. Words chosen carefully, but still sharp at the edges. The kind of exchange where nothing gets resolved, but everything gets heavier. She'd walked away telling herself it wasn't worth it. But her body hadn't agreed. Now standing alone in the kitchen, she pulled the cord again. It tightened further, almost mocking her. She let out a short breath through her nose and felt her jaw set. There it was, the same force she'd wanted to use earlier. The same urge to push, to insist, to make something give, just because she needed it to. She stopped mid-pull, fingers still wrapped around the cord. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Evening light slanted through the window, catching dust in the air. Nothing else was demanding urgency. Just her and this small, ridiculous knot. She loosened her grip slightly and looked at it. Really looked. The cord wasn't broken. It wasn't defective. It was just folded the wrong way, pressed tight by impatience. She tried again, slower. Instead of pulling, she traced the cord with her fingers, following the path of one loop until she found where it crossed another. She eased it back a fraction of an inch. The knot shifted, but didn't open. Her shoulders dropped a little, not in relief, in adjustment. She'd always believed anger was useful because it was efficient. It got things done. It cut through hesitation. But standing there, she could feel how that same force applied at the wrong moment only made things worse. The cord was proof. So was the conversation from earlier. She thought about what she'd wanted in that moment. Clarity, respect, resolution. She'd gone in pulling hard, insisting on movement. And just like this knot, everything had tightened. She set the cord down on the counter and stepped back, rubbing her hands together as if to shake off static. The irritation didn't disappear, but it paused. When she picked the cord up again, she tried something different. She lifted the knot so gravity could help. She loosened one loop at a time, gently, even when it felt inefficient. even when part of her wanted to hurry it along. The cord resisted less this way. One loop gave, then another. Her breath slowed without her telling it to. It struck her then how much of her anger came from wanting things to be over, wanting discomfort to end immediately, wanting the other person to understand right now, wanting the tension gone before she had to feel it fully. But knots don't respond to urgency. They respond to attention. She kept working at it, fingers patient now. Not kind exactly, but precise. The knot loosened in stages. Each small success made the next one easier, not harder. She felt something similar happen inside her. The tight band around her chest eased a notch. The replay of the earlier conversation softened, not erased, just less sharp at the edges. The need to win faded into something more manageable, the desire to understand what had actually gone wrong. The cord finally fell straight in her hands. No drama, no snap, just a sudden lack of resistance. She stood there holding it, surprised by how satisfying that felt, not because she'd conquered it, but because she hadn't. She plugged her phone in and set it on the counter. The screen lit up briefly, then went dark again. The house stayed quiet. The anger from earlier hadn't vanished. It was still present, like heat left in a pan after you turn the stove off. But it no longer felt like something that needed to be yanked on. She leaned against the counter and thought about the conversation again. Not to rewrite it, just to see it as it was a tangle of needs. Miscommunication, old habits pulling against each other. Maybe pulling harder wasn't going to help there either. She didn't know yet what she would say next time, or if there even needed to be a next time. Those decisions didn't feel urgent anymore. For now it was enough to know this force had never actually untangled anything in her life. It had only made the knots smaller and tighter. She picked up the cord once more, coiled it loosely, and set it where it wouldn't twist again so easily. Then she turned off the kitchen light and let the evening be what it was. She didn't feel calm after that, just clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't come with relief, but with a quieter sense of direction. Like knowing which road not to take, even if you're not sure where the right one leads yet. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the dresser. Outside, a car passed, and then the sound faded, leaving the street empty again. The day felt finished, but the tension from earlier still hovered, waiting to see what she would do with it. Her thumb hovered over the screen just like it had so many times before. There was a message she could send, a reply she'd already formed in her head. It wasn't cruel. It was firm, sharp in that controlled way that still carried heat. The kind of message that said, "I'm right, and now you'll understand why." She felt the same pull she'd felt with the charger, that urge to tug, to tighten the line and force a shape into place. She noticed it before acting on it. That didn't make the urge go away. It just stopped it from being invisible. She set the phone down beside her and rested her hands on her thighs. The memory of the cord came back not as a metaphor she analyzed, but as a sensation. The resistance, the tightening, the way force had backfired. She asked herself one simple question, without drama. If I pull here, does anything actually loosen? She already knew the answer. Anger, she was realizing, often comes from wanting a quick fix for a slow problem, wanting understanding on demand, wanting people to change in the moment you finally speak up, wanting the knot to disappear just because you're tired of looking at it. But some knots weren't made in one motion. They were made slowly over time, and they came undone the same way. She picked the phone back up and opened a blank note instead of the message thread. She wrote what she would have sent. Every word, every sharp edge. She didn't censor it. She let it spill out exactly as it wanted to. When she finished, she didn't feel lighter, but she felt steadier. Like the pressure had moved out of her chest and into the page where it couldn't tighten anything further. She closed the note and didn't save it. The room felt quieter after that. Not peaceful, just less charged. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The anger shifted again, losing its urgency. It became information instead of a command. A signal saying something here matters, something needs attention, not necessarily right now. That distinction mattered more than she'd expected. Tomorrow she could choose a different approach. She could speak without yanking. She could name what bothered her without trying to force agreement. Or she could decide that some tangles weren't hers to work on at all. Those options hadn't existed earlier when everything felt tight. She turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. The phone stayed face down on the dresser. The charger lay neatly coiled nearby, loose enough that it wouldn't knot itself again overnight. Her body remembered that looseness as she settled under the covers. Her shoulders dropped into the mattress. Her breath evened out, not because she told it to, but because nothing was pulling at it anymore. The situation hadn't resolved. The relationship hadn't magically smoothed out. The knot wasn't gone, it was just no longer being yanked on. And for tonight, that was enough. She drifted towards sleep, knowing one thing clearly. Not every problem responds to force, and not every answer needs to be pulled out of the dark. Some things untangle when you stop fighting them and give them space to loosen on their own. It started as a sound, a thin, nervous buzzing that didn't match the quiet of the room. He was in the break room at work late enough that the building felt half asleep. Most of the overhead lights were off. Only the corner lights were on, leaving soft shadows in the hallways. The vending machine hummed. The refrigerator clicked on and off. Everything felt slow and ordinary until that buzzing cut through it. A bee had gotten inside. It wasn't dramatic. Just one bee circling near the ceiling light, bumping into the glass cover, like it couldn't figure out why the sky wouldn't open. It looped again and again, louder than something that small had any right to be. He watched it for a second, hand still on the door handle. His first thought was automatic, someone's going to get stung. His second thought was also automatic, I should kill it. That was the reflex. Solve the problem fast, end the threat, move on. He grabbed a folded paper towel from the counter and stepped closer, eyes tracking the bee's erratic path. The buzzing got louder as it dipped lower, then shot back up toward the light. He raised his hand ready to swat, and then he paused. Not because he suddenly became a nature person, not because he had a moral issue with killing a bee. He paused because something in his chest tightened in a way that felt too familiar. He'd been carrying anger all day, not the explosive kind, the contained kind, the kind that stays behind your ribs, warming up slowly, waiting for a place to land. Earlier, there had been an interaction, one of those moments that's small on paper, but heavy in the body. A co-worker had said something dismissive, then smiled like it was nothing. A quick jab disguised as humor. It had landed on an old bruise. He hadn't reacted. Not outwardly. He'd kept his face neutral, finished what he needed to do, and walked away. But the anger followed him. It sat in his throat, waiting for another moment to come out. Now in the break room, with a paper towel in his hand, he realized how easy it would be to use the bee as an outlet. One quick swat, one tiny victory, a harmless target. But it wouldn't be harmless. Not for the bee, and not really for him either. Because he knew this feeling, the feeling of wanting to smash something that's annoying you, even when it isn't the real problem. The feeling of wanting relief more than you want wisdom. The bee hit the light cover again, a soft tap. Buzz, tap, buzz. He lowered the paper towel slightly and looked around. A small window sat above the sink, cracked open just a bit. Not enough. He walked over and pushed it wider. The window groaned softly on its track. Cool air slipped in. The bee kept circling the light, still trapped in its own panic. He stood beneath it and waited. Not long, but long enough. At first, nothing changed. The bee didn't immediately notice the open window. It continued its frantic loop, drawn to the brightest spot in the room, the way it was designed to be. He could feel his impatience rise. This is taking too long. That impatience was familiar too. It was the same impatience he felt in arguments. The same urge to force a resolution. To make the other person understand now. To swat the problem instead of dealing with it properly. He picked up a magazine from the table and held it flat, not to hit the bee, but to guide it, creating a gentle barrier, steering the bee's path away from the light and toward the darker side of the room where the open window waited. The bee dipped, then rose again, confused. He moved the magazine slowly, making space, not pressure. For a moment, the buzzing got louder, more frantic. He stayed steady. It took time. Not a lot, but enough to test him. Finally, the bee broke its loop. It drifted toward the window, hesitated near the opening like it wasn't sure it was real, then slipped out into the night. The buzzing vanished instantly. The room became what it had been before, quiet, dull, safe. He stood there with the magazine still in his hand, surprised by how satisfied he felt. Not because he'd won, because he hadn't added violence to a room that already held too much tension. He closed the window halfway again and leaned against the counter. The anger from earlier was still in him, but it had shifted. It no longer needed a target. It no longer felt like it had to hit something to be real. He realized then that a lot of his anger worked the same way as the bee. It got trapped under bright heat, under attention, under replay, under obsession, and it kept circling the same point until it exhausted him. Maybe he didn't need to swat it every time. Maybe he needed to open a way out. He didn't feel proud after the bee flew out. That would have felt too clean. What he felt instead was a kind of quiet steadiness, the kind that comes when you don't make things worse. He threw the paper towel into the trash and rinsed his hands at the sink. The water ran cool, then warmed. He let it run a second longer than necessary, watching it slip over his fingers and disappear down the drain. The break room stayed still. The vending machine hummed on. The refrigerator clicked. No one came in to comment on what had just happened. The moment passed without witnesses, and that felt right. He leaned against the counter and noticed that the tight band in his chest had loosened. Not all the way. Just enough that his breath didn't feel trapped anymore. The anger from earlier was still there, but it no longer felt like it needed an outlet. On his drive home, the image of the bee returned not as a symbol he was trying to decode, but as a simple memory. The frantic looping, the way it kept hitting the light, the way it hadn't needed punishment. It had needed an exit. Traffic was light. Street lights passed in steady intervals. His hands rested easily on the steering wheel. He thought again about the coworker, the comment, the smile that had followed like it was all a joke. He felt the familiar spark flare, but it didn't catch this time. There was space around it now. He didn't rehearse a confrontation. He didn't draft a message in his head. He just noticed the anger as it rose and let it move through without gripping it. At home, he kicked off his shoes and dropped his keys into the bowl by the door. The apartment greeted him with the quiet he'd been craving all day. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't reach for his phone. He stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the dark street. A porch light glowed across the way. A cat crossed the sidewalk and disappeared under a parked car. The world didn't seem interested in his frustration, and that helped. He realized then how often he treated anger like a problem that had to be crushed or expressed immediately, like something dangerous that couldn't be allowed to linger. But anger wasn't a bomb. It was more like that be uncomfortable, disruptive, loud, but not evil. It didn't need to be destroyed. It needed direction. That didn't mean letting people walk all over him. It didn't mean staying silent forever. It just meant choosing when and how to respond instead of letting the heat decide for him. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. The coolness settled him further. The night felt wide, unhurried. Tomorrow he might speak up. Or he might decide that the comment wasn't worth his energy after all. Either way, he would be choosing from a clearer place, not from the buzz of a trapped moment. He turned off the last light and let the room darken. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had found an open window. And without being fed, it drifted out on its own. It didn't hurt at first. That was the problem. They were halfway down the block before they noticed it, a small sharp pressure under the ball of the foot, not enough to stop walking, just enough to be annoying. The kind of discomfort you assume will disappear if you keep moving. They kept walking. Streetlights cast pale circles on the sidewalk. A late bus sighed past on the main road. The night had that ordinary, unfinished feeling, quiet. but not asleep yet. They had gone out for a short walk to cool off after a long day. Nothing more. No destination. No plan. The pressure grew with each step. Still manageable. Still ignorable. But it changed their stride just enough to throw everything else off. Their shoulders tightened, their jaws set. They felt irritation rise out of proportion to something so small. Earlier, there had been an argument. Not loud, not explosive, just persistent. The kind that doesn't end with slammed doors, but with 1,000 unfinished sentences hanging in the air. They had walked away, telling themselves it wasn't worth it, telling themselves to drop it. Now the stone in the shoe seemed to take on extra meaning. Every step landed on it again, and again, and again. They told themselves to keep going. I'll deal with it later. That thought felt familiar. They reached the corner and turned the pressure now unmistakable. A tiny rock probably wedged just right to cause maximum irritation without actually injuring anything. Their pace slowed. Their breathing shortened. Anger has a way of hitching a ride on physical discomfort. The body starts reacting before the mind catches up. By the time they stopped under a streetlight, they were more upset than the situation deserved. They bent down, lifted one foot, and shook it once. Nothing happened. The stone stayed put. They sighed sharper than they meant to and leaned against a metal signpost. The light buzzed faintly overhead. The sidewalk was empty. For a moment, they considered just pushing through. It's not that bad. That thought felt familiar too. Instead, they sat down on the curb. The concrete was cool through their clothes. They unlaced the shoe slowly, fingers moving with less urgency now that they'd stopped. When they tipped it upside down, a small pebble fell into their palm. Smooth, gray, ordinary. They stared at it longer than necessary. So much irritation for something this small. They set the pebble on the ground and slipped the shoe back on, not tying it yet. When they stood and tested their weight, the relief was immediate. The foot landed cleanly. The body responded right away, shoulders easing, breath deepening stride, returning to normal. The contrast was striking. They hadn't realized how much effort they'd been putting into compensating. Adjusting their walk, tensing their leg, holding their frustration in a tight, inefficient way. All because they hadn't wanted to stop. They tied the shoe properly this time and took a few steps back and forth under the light. No pain, no pressure. Just the simple, quiet act of walking. And that's when it clicked, not as a lesson, not as a speech, but as a plain recognition. They had been doing the same thing emotionally all day. The argument from earlier wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't unforgivable. It was just lodged. A small thing sitting in the wrong place, changing the way everything else felt. And instead of stopping to deal with it, they'd kept moving, kept adjusting, kept telling themselves it would pass, but it hadn't passed. It had rubbed. They started walking again, this time more slowly. The night felt different now, less hostile. The same streetlights, the same sidewalk. But without the constant irritation, everything softened. They thought about how often anger works like that pebble, not dramatic enough to demand attention, not painful enough to force action, just irritating enough to poison every step if you let it stay. They also thought about how easy it would have been to kick the shoe against the curb, to swear, to get mad at the night for being inconvenient. None of that would have removed the stone. Stopping had. They reached the end of the block and turned back toward home. The walk felt shorter now, lighter. The anger from earlier hadn't disappeared. It was still there waiting to be addressed, but it no longer had a physical foothold. It wasn't riding every step. They realized something quietly. As they walked, sometimes letting go doesn't mean pretending you're fine. It means stopping long enough to take out the thing that's hurting you before you keep going. They didn't know yet what they would say about the argument, or when, or if it even needed words. Those decisions could wait. For now it was enough to walk without wincing. The streetlight behind them buzzed softly as they moved on, leaving the small gray pebble where it belonged on the ground, not inside them. It didn't hurt at first. That was the problem. They were halfway down the block before they noticed it, a small sharp pressure under the ball of the foot. Not enough to stop walking, just enough to be annoying. The kind of discomfort you assume will disappear if you keep moving. They kept walking. Streetlights cast pale circles on the sidewalk. A late bus sighed past on the main road. The night had that ordinary unfinished feeling, quiet, but not asleep yet. They had gone out for a short walk to cool off after a long day. Nothing more. No destination, no plan. The pressure grew with each step, still manageable, still ignorable. But it changed their stride just enough to throw everything else off. Their shoulders tightened, their jaw set. They felt irritation rise out of proportion to something so small. Earlier there had been an argument, not loud, not explosive, just persistent. The kind that doesn't end with slammed doors, but with 1,000 unfinished sentences hanging in the air. They had walked away, telling themselves it wasn't worth it, telling themselves to drop it. Now the stone in the shoe seemed to take on extra meaning. Every step landed on it again and again and again. They told themselves to keep going. I'll deal with it later. That thought felt familiar. They reached the corner and turned the pressure, now unmistakable. A tiny rock probably wedged just right to cause maximum irritation without actually injuring anything. Their pace slowed. Their breathing shortened. Anger has a way of hitching a ride on physical discomfort. The body starts reacting before the mind catches up. By the time they stopped under a streetlight, they were more upset than the situation deserved. They bent down, lifted one foot, and shook it once. Nothing happened. The stone stayed put. They sighed sharper than they meant to and leaned against a metal signpost. The light buzzed faintly overhead. The sidewalk was empty. For a moment, they considered just pushing through. It's not that bad. That thought felt familiar too. Instead, they sat down on the curb. The concrete was cool through their clothes. They unlaced the shoe slowly, fingers moving with less urgency now that they'd stopped. When they tipped it upside down, a small pebble fell into their palm. Smooth, gray, ordinary. They stared at it longer than necessary. So much irritation for something this small. They set the pebble on the ground and slipped the shoe back on, not tying it yet. When they stood and tested their weight, the relief was immediate. The foot landed cleanly. The body responded right away, shoulders easing, breath deepening stride, returning to normal. The contrast was striking. They hadn't realized how much effort they'd been putting into compensating, adjusting their walk, tensing their leg, holding their frustration in a tight, inefficient way. All because they hadn't wanted to stop. They tied the shoe properly this time and took a few steps back and forth under the light. No pain, no pressure, just the simple, quiet act of walking. And that's when it clicked, not as a lesson, not as a speech, but as a plain recognition. They had been doing the same thing emotionally all day. The argument from earlier wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't unforgivable. It was just lodged. A small thing sitting in the wrong place, changing the way everything else felt. And instead of stopping to deal with it, they'd kept moving, kept adjusting, kept telling themselves it would pass, but it hadn't passed. It had rubbed. They started walking again, this time more slowly. The night felt different now, less hostile. The same streetlights, the same sidewalk. But without the constant irritation, everything softened. They thought about how often anger works like that pebble. Not dramatic enough to demand attention, not painful enough to force action. Just irritating enough to poison every step if you let it stay. They also thought about how easy it would have been to kick the shoe against the curb, to swear, to get mad at the night for being inconvenient. None of that would have removed the stone. Stopping had. They reached the end of the block and turned back toward home. The walk felt shorter now, lighter. The anger from earlier hadn't disappeared. It was still there waiting to be addressed, but it no longer had a physical foothold. It wasn't riding every step. They realized something quietly as they walked. Sometimes letting go doesn't mean pretending you're fine. It means stopping long enough to take out the thing that's hurting you before you keep going. They didn't know yet what they would say about the argument, or when, or if it even needed words. Those decisions could wait. For now, it was enough to walk without wincing. The streetlight behind them buzzed softly as they moved on, leaving the small gray pebble where it belonged on the ground, not inside them. Some problems don't tighten all at once. They tighten slowly the more you pull at them. That night, the person stood in a small laundry room folding clothes straight from the dryer. The machine had just finished its cycle, releasing a burst of warm air and the faint smell of clean cotton. The room was narrow, functional. The kind of place meant for small, repetitive tasks. One sleeve, one sock, one familiar motion after another. At the bottom of the dryer drum, a long drawstring lay tangled around itself. It belonged to a hoodie, thin and flexible, twisted into a tight knot near the end. The person picked it up, already feeling a trace of irritation rise. Of course. Why does this always happen? The knot didn't look complicated at first, just a loop pulled through another loop. Something that should come apart easily if handled the right way. The person pinched one end and tugged gently. The knot resisted. A little more force followed. The string stretched. The knot tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to change its shape. The person frowned, focusing more closely now. Overthinking often begins here, not with panic, but with effort. The belief that a small problem will respond to just a bit more pressure. The person pulled again, this time from the other side. The knot shifted, but didn't loosen. Instead, it became denser, the loops pressing into each other like they were trying to disappear. The dryer clicked softly as it cooled. Silence filled the room. The person felt the familiar tension in their shoulders, the same tension that appeared earlier that day during a conversation that went nowhere, an email that seemed impossible to word correctly, a decision that refused to feel settled. Why is this not working? It should be simple. The drawstring twisted further as the person tried a different angle, fingers moving faster now. The knot responded by becoming smaller, tighter, more stubborn. The person paused. Breath held for a moment longer than usual. This felt familiar too. There are moments when effort becomes the problem. When the very act of trying to fix something makes it worse. Overthinking lives comfortably in this space where every attempt to resolve creates more complexity. The person dropped the drawstring onto the counter and rested their hands there, palms flat. The surface was cool grounding. The knot stayed where it was unchanged. The mind, however, kept pulling. What if I leave it like this? What if it gets worse? I should figure this out now. The urge to act felt urgent, even though nothing depended on it. The hoodie would still be wearable. The night wouldn't collapse if the knot stayed tied. Still, the discomfort lingered. The person picked up the string again, but this time noticed something different. The knot wasn't aggressive. It wasn't resisting out of defiance. It was simply responding to the direction of force. Pulling tightened it. Twisting confused it. Speed worked against it. The person slowed down, not as a strategy, just because the fingers were tired. Holding the knot gently, they rotated it slightly, not pulling, just looking. The shape revealed itself gradually, how one loop passed under another, how the tension traveled along the string. Nothing loosened yet, but nothing tightened either. That felt new. The laundry room remained quiet. The rest of the clothes waited patiently on the counter, unaffected by this small struggle. The world outside didn't know or care about the knot. The person exhaled, realizing they had been holding their breath again. Overthinking often convinces us that urgency equals importance. That if we don't solve something immediately, we're failing at something unseen. But here, with the knot resting in the palm of the hand, urgency lost its credibility. The person set the drawstring down once more and folded a towel instead. The motion was automatic, familiar. It didn't require problem solving. As the towel was smoothed and stacked, the shoulders relaxed without instruction. The knot was still there when the person returned to it. No worse, no better, just unchanged. That alone felt like a quiet correction. Not everything tightens if left alone. Some things only tighten when pulled. The person picked up the drawstring again this time, with less intention to win and more willingness to see. The fingers moved slower, separating one small loop from another, testing space instead of force. The knot didn't come undone yet, but for the first time, it stopped getting tighter. And that was enough to change how the moment felt. The knot rested quietly in the person's hand. It no longer felt like an enemy, just a small problem waiting without urgency. The laundry room light hummed softly overhead, and the folded clothes formed a neat stack beside the dryer. The person turned the drawstring slowly, letting it hang between two fingers. Without pulling, the loops began to show their structure. One crossed under another. One end had been pulled through at an angle that made everything look more complicated than it was. The mind noticed the same pattern it often fell into, trying to force clarity instead of allowing it. Overthinking doesn't always feel frantic. Sometimes it feels precise, controlled, as if tightening the grip will bring order. But the knot offered a different response. Every sharp movement made it worse. Every pause made it more workable. The person placed the knot down on the counter and stepped back half a pace. That small distance mattered. It broke the sense of pressure. It gave the eyes a chance to see the whole thing, instead of just the tight center. The memory of the day returned again. A moment where words had been chosen too quickly. A reaction that had closed a conversation instead of opening it. The urge to replay it had been strong, almost automatic. But replaying had tightened it too. The person picked up the drawstring again this time, holding it loosely, allowing gravity to help. One end dropped slightly, and the knot shifted. A tiny opening appeared, not enough to undo it, but enough to show possibility. That was all it took. The fingers moved carefully now, not trying to solve the whole thing at once. Just easing one loop, creating a bit of space, letting tension move instead of trapping it. The knot loosened almost on its own. There was no sudden release, no satisfying snap, just a gradual softening until the loops separated and the drawstring fell straight again, simple and unremarkable. The person noticed the relief not in the hands, but in the chest. That felt familiar too. So many worries work the same way. They tighten when we panic. They harden when we demand immediate answers. They stay tangled when we keep pulling at them from the same angle. The person laid the hoodie on top of the folded clothes, the drawstring now resting easily along the fabric. The problem had been resolved, but not through effort, through patience. The mind recognized something without needing to turn it into a rule space helps. Slowness helps. Not every knot responds to strength. The laundry room felt quieter now, even though nothing about it had changed. The machine was off. The light remained the same. The stack of clothes waited to be put away. The difference was internal. The person carried the clothes down the hallway, noticing how the body moved more freely. The shoulders no longer braced. The steps felt lighter. The earlier worries hadn't disappeared. They would likely return later in another form, another setting. That wasn't a failure. It was just how the mind worked. But now, there was a reference point. When thoughts begin to tighten, pulling harder isn't always the answer. Sometimes the most effective response is to stop pulling at all, to step back, to create space, to let the structure reveal itself. The person placed the folded clothes in a drawer and closed it gently. The sound was soft, final, without force. The knot was gone. Not because it had been defeated, but because it had been allowed to loosen. And the rest of the evening continued without adding anything extra. That was enough. Some forms of pressure don't come from being trapped. They come from believing you are. That evening, the person stood in a narrow hallway of an apartment building facing a heavy door at the end. It wasn't an emergency door. Just an old one painted off-white with a metal handle worn smooth from years of use. The hallway light flickered faintly, giving everything a tired, late-day look. The person had been pacing for a while. Not back and forth exactly. More like circling the same few steps, stopping, starting again. The mind was busy running through possibilities that all seemed to end in the same place. I can't get out of this. There's no good option. I'm stuck here. The door had become part of that story, not because it was doing anything, but because it was there, solid, unmoving at the end of the hall. It looked final, closed, certain. The person walked toward it and stopped a step away. The handle reflected a dull glint of light. For some reason, the door felt heavier than it probably was. The thought arrived fully formed. I need to figure this out before I move. That thought had been around all day, maybe longer. The idea that clarity must come first. That understanding is the key that unlocks progress. The person rested a hand against the door. It felt cool, solid, real. Nothing happened. Overthinking often builds walls out of assumptions. Once the wall is there, the mind treats it as fact. The door becomes locked in the story, even if no one ever checked the handle. The person pressed slightly, then pulled the hand back, unsure why they hadn't just tried to open it yet. There was hesitation now. A quiet fear of discovering what would happen if the door didn't move. What if it really is locked? What if I'm wrong? What if there's no way through? The hallway was silent. Somewhere far away, a neighbor's TV murmured through a wall. Life continued unconcerned with the standoff happening here. The person leaned against the wall and slid down until sitting on the floor. The door stayed where it was, neutral, uninterested. The thoughts grew louder in the stillness. They always did when there was nothing else to occupy the space. I should have decided earlier. I missed my chance. Now I have to stay here. The pressure in the chest felt familiar. That tight, compressed feeling that comes when the mind insists there is only one outcome, and it's already too late. The person looked again at the door from this lower angle. It didn't look different. Still closed. Still quiet. But something shifted, not in the situation, but in attention. What if the door isn't the problem? That thought didn't solve anything. It didn't open the door. But it loosened the grip just enough to create space around the idea of being trapped. The person stood up slowly, not with determination, more with curiosity. They reached for the handle fingers, wrapping around the cool metal. There was a pause. The mind braced. The body tensed, expecting resistance. The handle turned easily. The door didn't fly open. It didn't make a dramatic sound. It just moved smoothly, quietly, like it had always been able to. The person stopped mid-motion, surprised. The opening revealed another hallway beyond, similar lighting, similar walls, nothing remarkable. Just space. The door hadn't been locked at all. The person stood there for a moment, hand still on the handle, absorbing the feeling. Not relief exactly. More like disbelief mixed with something softer. All that time, all that pressure, and the door was never closed. The mind tried to respond, to turn this into a lesson, a conclusion, a warning. But before it could, another realization slipped in. The door hadn't changed. Only the assumption had. The person stepped through slowly, not rushing, not celebrating, just moving into the open space beyond, aware of how easily the body followed once the idea of being trapped dissolved. Behind them, the door stayed where it was, open now but unchanged in nature. It had never been an obstacle. It had just been part of the scenery. The person paused a few steps into the next hall, noticing how different the body felt. Lighter, less compressed. Not because everything was solved, but because one heavy belief had quietly fallen away. The thought returned gentler this time. Maybe some exits don't require effort. They require checking. And with that, the person continued on, leaving the door behind, not defeated, not triumphant, just no longer mistaken for a barrier. The next hallway felt no different from the first. Same worn carpet, same low hum from the lights overhead. And yet the person noticed how the body moved through it with less resistance. Steps felt easier, breathing deeper. The situation itself hadn't changed much. There were still decisions waiting, still uncertainty ahead. But something fundamental had shifted. The sense of being trapped had lost its grip. The person slowed near a corner and leaned briefly against the wall. The cool surface pressed gently through the jacket. The mind began to replay the earlier moment at the door, not with urgency but with a kind of quiet curiosity. How many times had something like this happened before? Moments when the mind assumed there was no way forward, when options felt exhausted before they were even tested, when the effort went into thinking rather than checking. Overthinking builds its own architecture. It creates barriers out of hesitation, fear, and imagined outcomes. Once built, those barriers feel solid, real, unavoidable. But many of them aren't locked. They're just untested. The person walked on, passing a stairwell. The door there was open, revealing a narrow set of concrete steps leading down. It was another path, not necessarily the one to take now, but visible, available. That felt important. Choice doesn't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it arrives as access. The mind tried to grasp this, to organize it into a principle, but the person didn't linger there. The hallway continued, and the body followed. At the end, a window overlooked the street below. Evening had settled fully now. Cars passed. A bus hissed as it stopped and started again. Life was moving whether or not the person felt fully ready to join it. The window wasn't an exit. just a view. But it widened perspective again, offering a reminder that the world didn't shrink just because the mind did. The person rested a hand on the windowsill and looked down. The earlier pressure felt distant now. Not gone, but softened. The thoughts that had once insisted on immediate answers were quieter, as if unsure of their authority. It wasn't that the door had solved everything. It hadn't. It had simply revealed that the sense of being stuck had been a misreading. That realization didn't demand action. It didn't require a new plan. It just changed the posture from which everything else would be approached. The person turned back and began walking again, this time, without scanning for exits or obstacles, just moving forward one step at a time. Overthinking often tells us we must understand everything before we move. But life rarely works that way. Movement itself clarifies. Contact reveals options that thought alone can't. The door from earlier was out of sight now, but its presence remained not as an image, but as a reference point. A reminder that not every closed-looking thing is closed. Not every pause is a dead end. The person reached the end of the hall and pushed through another door, this one leading outside. Cool air met the face immediately. The night was calm. Familiar sounds returned, traffic voices, a distant siren fading into the background. No resistance. No drama. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The person stood there for a moment, adjusting to the open space, noticing how easily the body adapted once the idea of confinement had dropped. Some doors don't need to be broken down. Some walls don't need to be climbed. Some exits only require the courage to check the handle. The person walked forward into the night, not certain of every next step, but no longer convinced that movement was impossible. And that was enough to keep going. Some thoughts don't need answers. They need permission to fall. That afternoon, the person was walking through a small park near home. Not a destination walk. Just a loop around familiar paths, the kind taken without expectation. The air carried the quiet chill of late autumn, cool, but not sharp. Leaves had gathered everywhere along the edges of the path, beneath benches around the bases of trees. The person walked slowly, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the breeze. The day had been full of thinking. Not urgent thinking, persistent thinking. The kind that circles without landing. Did I handle that right? What if I misunderstood something? Why does this keep coming back? Each thought felt light on its own, but together they weighed down the mind, like holding too many small things at once. A leaf skittered across the path, pushed by a brief gust of wind. It spun once, then settled near the curb. The person noticed it without stopping, without assigning meaning. Just a leaf moving where the air carried it. The thoughts continued anyway. Overthinking often comes from holding on longer than necessary, replaying moments that have already passed, carrying conversations that are no longer happening. The mind keeps them close, as if holding them will prevent loss. The person slowed near a cluster of trees and stopped beside a bench. The bench was empty, its wooden slats dusted with fallen leaves in shades of brown and gold. Some were curled and dry, others still held a trace of color. The person brushed a few leaves aside and sat down. The bench creaked softly under the shift of weight. The mind tried to follow its usual rhythm, bringing the same thoughts forward again. But something about the stillness made the repetition feel more obvious, like watching the same scene loop without progress. The person leaned forward slightly and picked up a leaf resting near their shoe. It was fragile now, edges thin and brittle. When turned over, the veins were clearly visible, branching outward from the center. This leaf had once been green. It had once been part of something alive and growing. Now, it had let go. Not in a dramatic way, not as a decision, just as a natural response to time. The person rolled the leaf gently between two fingers. It crumbled a little, leaving faint dust behind. No resistance, no effort. There was a quiet contrast between that and the mind's behavior. The mind wanted to keep everything intact, preserve every detail, maintain the exact shape of thoughts long after their purpose had passed, as if letting go meant something important would be lost forever. The person released the leaf and watched it fall back onto the bench, joining the others. It didn't stand out. It didn't disappear. It simply returned to where it belonged. The wind moved through the trees again. More leaves loosened and drifted down, landing without sound. The ground didn't try to catch them. The branches didn't hold them back. The person leaned back against the bench and let the shoulders drop. A breath came and went, without direction. The thoughts still appeared, but they didn't feel as solid. One thought surfaced clearly: maybe I don't need to carry this right now. It wasn't a conclusion, just a possibility. The person watched another leaf fall, this one slower, turning gently as it descended. It didn't rush. It didn't hesitate. It moved as it was meant to. Overthinking often adds urgency where none exists. It convinces the mind that now is the only moment to solve, to decide to fix. But the park offered a different pace. Everything here moved according to its own timing. The person sat there longer than planned, watching leaves gather where they would, unbothered by order or arrangement. The ground accepted them without question. A few thoughts tried to cling, unfinished ideas, imagined futures, but they felt less convincing here, less worthy of being held so tightly. The person stood up slowly and brushed the bench clean again, though there was no real need. The leaves returned almost immediately, drifting back as the wind shifted. That small futility was oddly comforting. You can clear space, but you don't have to control what falls. The person stepped back onto the path and continued walking. Leaves crunched softly underfoot, breaking apart with each step. They didn't protest. They didn't linger. The mind noticed this too. Some thoughts are meant to fall away on their own. Not pushed, not solved, just allowed to return to the ground. And as the person walked on, that idea stayed not as something to remember, but as something already happening. The path curved gently ahead, disappearing behind a line of trees. The person followed it without thinking much about where it led. Shoes moved through dry leaves, each step producing a soft, uneven sound. Some leaves cracked, others folded quietly into the ground. The mind noticed the sound, then let it go. A little farther along the path widened into a small clearing. Sunlight filtered through the branches in thin lines, catching dust in the air. Leaves lay everywhere on the ground, on the low stone wall nearby, gathered in shallow piles where the wind had paused. The person stopped again, resting a hand on the cool stone. The surface felt steady. Unconcerned with what landed on it, overthinking often feels like an attempt to keep things from falling apart. The mind holds onto ideas, memories, plans, worried that if they're released, something essential will be lost. But here, nothing seemed to be missing. The trees weren't bare because they had failed. They were bare because it was time. The person watched as another leaf detached and drifted down slow and uneven. It didn't fall straight. It wandered, changed direction, then finally settled near the base of the tree. No effort, no resistance. The mind offered a thought. What if I just let this pass? It wasn't a command. It didn't ask for discipline. It was closer to curiosity than intention. Some worries returned lightly. A moment from earlier in the week, a question that hadn't been answered yet. They appeared, hovered, then faded like leaves brushing past without landing. The person noticed how different this felt from trying to push thoughts away. Nothing was being rejected. Nothing was being solved. The thoughts were simply no longer being held. A breeze moved through the clearing, lifting several leaves at once. They skidded across the ground, then dropped again. The wind didn't choose which ones to move. It didn't aim. It just passed through. The person realized how often the mind behaves differently, selecting certain thoughts, gripping them tightly, replaying them until they feel heavier than they are. As if attention alone could make them permanent, but attention can also be released. The person sat down on the low stone wall and let the feet rest on the ground. The body felt settled now, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being carried unnecessarily. The mind grew quieter in the background, not empty, just less crowded. Thoughts still passed through, but they didn't demand a response. They didn't line up to be examined. There was a subtle relief in that. Not relief from answers, relief from effort. The clearing remained unchanged. Leaves continued to fall one by one without announcement. The ground accepted them without comment. The person stood up again and brushed a few leaves from their jacket. Some fell back immediately. Others clung for a second longer before dropping. That felt familiar too. Some thoughts fall right away. Others take a little time. Neither needs to be forced. As the person walked toward the edge of the park, the sounds of the neighborhood returned, cars in the distance, a door closing somewhere, a faint voice carried by the air. Ordinary life waited just beyond the trees. The person didn't feel lighter in a dramatic way. There was no sense of breakthrough, just a quiet reduction in pressure, less holding, less arranging. The worries from earlier would probably come back later, in different forms, on different days. That was part of being human. But now, there was an understanding that didn't need to be remembered actively. Thoughts don't need to be cleared for peace to appear. They only need to stop being collected. Leaves don't fall because the tree forces them to. They fall because the season changes. The person stepped out of the park and onto the sidewalk carrying nothing extra, letting the rest return to the ground behind them. And that was enough. They finished the last delivery right as the sky started to fade from gray into that early morning blue. Not quite sunrise, just the moment when the night finally loosened its grip. The van was quieter now. No more route alerts, no more quick stops. Only the soft sound of tires rolling over empty streets. They didn't go home right away. Instead, they turned toward a small park a few blocks off the main road, the kind of park that stayed almost empty on weekdays. A few benches, a looping path, tall trees that had been there long before any of the surrounding buildings. They parked, stepped out, and pulled their jacket tighter. The air smelled like damp earth and leaves, fresh in a way that made the lungs feel more awake. They walked slowly down the path, boots pressing into the ground with a gentle crunch. Leaves had fallen overnight, and each step made a quiet sound like paper being folded. They liked this hour. It wasn't busy yet. No joggers, no kids, no dogs barking. Just space. They had been feeling something lately that they didn't know how to name at first. A kind of dull pressure. Not panic, not sadness. More like the sense that their life was small. Not in a bad way. Just unnoticed. They drove around all day, dropping off packages, following directions, meeting deadlines. People opened doors, signed screens, took boxes, then moved on. Sometimes they were thanked. Sometimes they weren't. Either way, it all disappeared quickly. They had caught themselves thinking more than once. Is this it? Am I doing anything that matters? It wasn't that they wanted fame. They just wanted to feel like they had weight in the world, like their existence left something behind. They reached a stretch of path where the trees grew thicker. The light shifted under the branches, softer and darker, like stepping into another kind of room. There was one tree in particular, massive, old, with a trunk so wide it looked like it had been built rather than grown. Its bark was rough and deeply lined. Its branches spread out calmly, like it had all the time in the world. They stopped in front of it and tilted their head back. The tree didn't look impressive in a loud way. It wasn't blooming. It wasn't colorful. It was simply there. And somehow, standing near it, they felt their chest loosen a little. They remembered something they had read once, a simple fact that had felt abstract at the time. Trees make oxygen. Quietly. Constantly. Without asking to be noticed, they stood there looking up through the branches and let that sink in. The tree didn't need to do anything dramatic to be valuable. It wasn't proving itself. It was supporting life just by existing. They looked around at the other trees, the ones that lined the path, and filled the park like a slow, steady crowd. No one was applauding them. No one was taking photos. And yet the air in their lungs was clean because these trees were here. They took a deeper breath. It felt strange to realize how much they depended on something they rarely thought about. They thought about their own life again. The small things that didn't get counted. The steady reliability. The way they showed up for work even when they didn't feel like it. the way they made sure packages arrived. Medicine got delivered, little everyday needs got met. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. They started walking again, slower now. Not because they were tired, but because they didn't feel the need to rush away from this feeling. Under the trees, the world felt less demanding. They didn't feel bigger. They felt more placed, like they belonged somewhere even without being seen. They sat down on a bench not far from the old tree, letting their body rest without checking the time. The sky had grown lighter now, a soft wash of pale color behind the branches. A bird moved somewhere above them. Leaves shifted gently as a breeze passed through. Nothing felt urgent. They thought about how rarely they allowed themselves to simply exist without measuring the moment, without asking whether it was productive or meaningful enough to justify taking up space. The forest didn't seem to worry about that. The trees weren't competing with one another. They weren't trying to stand out. Each one took what it needed, light water space, and gave back oxygen, shade, and quiet stability in return. That felt important. They realized that value didn't always announce itself. Some forms of worth worked slowly, invisibly, sustaining things in ways that were only noticed when they were gone. They thought about how many people depended on what they did without ever knowing their name. The deliveries that kept daily life running, the consistency that others relied on without thinking twice. They had dismissed those things as ordinary. But the forest was ordinary too. And still, it kept the world alive. They closed their eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, feeling the air fill their chest. It felt fuller, somehow richer, as if their body recognized what their mind was only beginning to accept. They didn't need to be exceptional to matter. They didn't need to leave a dramatic mark. Being steady, being present, being part of the system that allowed life to keep moving. That was enough. When they stood up, their steps felt more grounded, less rushed. The old tree remained behind them, unchanged, unbothered. As they walked back toward the van, the city was starting to wake up. A few lights flicked on. A distant engine started. They knew the day would be busy again. Packages, routes, the familiar rhythm of work. But they carried something different with them now, a quiet understanding that even if no one noticed, even if nothing about their life looked impressive from the outside, they were still contributing simply by being here. Like the forest, silent, steady, essential. He stepped out onto the small rooftop during his lunch break, the door closing softly behind him. The city was bright at this hour, washed in sunlight that flattened shadows and made everything feel exposed. He squinted slightly and leaned against the railing. Down below, traffic moved in steady lines. Horns sounded now and then, impatient but distant. The air smelled faintly of hot concrete and coffee from somewhere nearby. He liked coming up here when he needed a pause. Not because it was peaceful, it wasn't. But because no one expected anything from him for a few minutes. He checked his phone out of habit, then slipped it back into his pocket without opening anything. The screen felt louder than the world around him. Lately, he had been carrying a strange feeling through his days. a sense of being invisible even while surrounded by people. In meetings, he spoke when it was his turn. He did his work. He met deadlines. Still, it felt like something about him wasn't registering. Others seemed to move forward more easily. They were noticed, remembered. He told himself he shouldn't care about that. That wanting to be seen was shallow. But the feeling didn't go away just because he judged it. He tilted his head back and looked up at the sky. It was a solid, blinding blue. No clouds, no softness. Somewhere up there, he knew stars were still burning. Even now, even at noon. He remembered learning that as a kid and being strangely unsettled by it. The idea that something so bright could exist and yet be completely hidden by light. Standing there now, it made sense in a different way. He thought about how often he mistook visibility for existence. How easily he assumed that if something wasn't noticed, it wasn't there. But the stars didn't stop shining just because no one could see them. They didn't dim themselves during the day. They didn't disappear. They waited. He felt his shoulders drop a little as that thought settled in. Maybe the parts of him that felt unseen weren't gone. Maybe they were simply not in the kind of light that revealed them. The wind brushed against his face, warm and dry. He closed his eyes for a moment and focused on his breathing. In, out. He didn't need to perform here. He didn't need to explain himself. The rooftop wasn't impressed by anyone. He opened his eyes again and looked back at the sky. The stars were still there, unbothered, unrushed. He stood there until his break was almost over, letting the idea sit quietly in the background of his thoughts. When he turned to go back inside, he felt less anxious than before. Not because anything had changed, but because he no longer felt erased by the brightness of the day. He went back to his desk and settled into the afternoon without the usual tightness in his chest. Emails came in, tasks lined up. The familiar rhythm returned, but something in him stayed softer. As the hours passed, he noticed how often he had been checking for signs of acknowledgement without realizing it. A nod, a comment, a reaction that said, "Yes, you matter here." That need didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. He remembered the stars again, how they didn't rush to be seen, how their existence didn't depend on the sky being dark enough to show them. They burned steadily regardless. Later, as he left the building and stepped into the bright street, the sunlight felt less harsh than it had earlier. Not because it had changed, but because he wasn't taking it personally anymore. He walked a few blocks before heading toward the train, letting the city move around him. People passed by busy with their own thoughts, their own timelines. No one was looking at him. And for once, that didn't sting. He realized that he had been asking the wrong question. Not, am I being seen right now? But am I still here even when I'm not? The answer was quiet but clear. Yes. His worth didn't turn on and off with attention. It didn't fade under brighter lights. There were parts of him that lived in deeper layers, skills, values, kindnesses that didn't always show up on the surface. They were still active, still real. That evening, as the sky finally darkened and the first stars began to appear, He paused on the platform and looked up. There they were. Nothing about them had changed since noon, only the conditions. He felt a gentle reassurance settle in his body. He didn't need to force himself into visibility. He didn't need to compete with the daylight. Some things shine in their own time, and some truths are steady enough to wait. She didn't mean to drop the bowl. It slipped from her hands while she was drying it, the towel catching on the edge just enough to twist it out of her grip. It hit the floor with a sharp sound louder than she expected. Then silence. She stood still for a second, heart beating faster than it needed to. The bowl lay in pieces at her feet, clean breaks running through the ceramic like thin lines drawn on purpose. She exhaled slowly and crouched down. Some of the pieces were large, some were small, almost dust-like at the edges. Nothing was completely shattered, but there was no pretending it was fine. She gathered the pieces carefully, placing them on the table one by one. The room was quiet except for the soft scrape of ceramic against wood. She had always hated breaking things, not because of the mess, but because of what it made her feel careless, clumsy, like she should have known better. That feeling was familiar. It showed up in other places too, when she said the wrong thing, when she trusted too quickly, when something in her life cracked instead of holding together. She sat down and looked at the pieces spread out in front of her. The bowl had been one of her favorites. Not expensive, just comfortable. The kind of object that fit easily into her hands, like it had learned their shape over time. She remembered hearing once about Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Not hiding the cracks, not smoothing them away, highlighting them. At the time, she had thought it sounded poetic, but impractical. Something nice to look at in a book, not something you actually did. Now, with the broken bowl in front of her, the idea returned differently. She picked up one piece and traced the edge of the break with her finger. It was sharp, but precise. Clean. The break wasn't random. It followed a line that had always been there, hidden in the structure, waiting for the right moment to show itself. That thought stayed with her. How many of her own cracks had formed the same way? Not suddenly, but quietly over time under pressure. She thought about the moments she usually tried to hide, the ones she replayed late at night and wished she could edit out of her story. She had learned to move past them quickly, to patch things up in a way that made them less visible, to act like nothing had happened. But the bowl on the table refused that option. It couldn't go back to being what it was. She could throw it away. That would be easier. She could replace it with something new, something unbroken, something that didn't carry a history. She sat with those options for a while. Then she imagined the gold-filled cracks of Kintsugi, the way the lines didn't apologize for themselves, the way the object became something else still useful, but also marked. She didn't reach for glue yet. Instead, she stayed there breathing, letting the discomfort settle without trying to rush past it. The bowl was broken, and for once, she didn't feel the urge to hide that fact. She cleaned the table and laid the pieces out again slower this time, as if the pace itself mattered. There was no rush to fix anything yet. She studied the breaks, carefully noticing how they fit together, how each line had a logic of its own. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. As she worked, she thought about how quickly she usually tried to move on from things that hurt. How often she rushed to become functional again before she had actually understood what had broken. This felt different. Here, repair required attention, patience, a willingness to look closely at the damage without turning away. She imagined the gold tracing each crack, not covering it, but following it exactly as it was, turning the fracture into something intentional. It made her think of her own scars, the moments she had learned to call mistakes, the times she wished she had been stronger, quieter, less affected. What if those moments weren't meant to disappear? What if they were meant to be acknowledged, outlined gently, held with care? She realized that healing didn't always mean returning to the original shape. Sometimes it meant allowing a new one to form. The bowl once repaired would never look the same, but it would carry its history openly, without apology. She liked that idea, not because it made pain beautiful, but because it made honesty possible. When she finally stood up, the pieces remained on the table, still separate. The work wasn't finished, and that was fine. Some things didn't need to be rushed into wholeness. As the room grew quieter, she felt a familiar softness settle in her chest. Not sadness, not relief, acceptance. She turned off the light and left the bowl where it was broken but seen. And for the first time, she understood that her own healing might look the same, unfinished, visible, and still worthy of care. Some worries don't come from what we see. They come from how unclear the seeing has become. Late that night, the person stood in a small bathroom, the kind with soft yellow light and a mirror that had seen better days. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation fan. The sink held a few water spots. The mirror showed thin streaks where steam had dried unevenly. The person leaned closer, noticing their own reflection looked slightly dull. Not distorted, just muted, like something was between the eyes and the image. It had been one of those days where the mind kept questioning itself. Not loudly, just persistently. Did I misread that situation? Why do I feel unsure about something so small? What if I'm not seeing this clearly? The person reached for a hand towel hanging nearby and wiped a small section of the mirror. The cloth moved easily, leaving behind a clearer patch. The reflection there looked sharper, more precise. The contrast was noticeable. The rest of the mirror still looked hazy, but that clean spot stood out. Nothing about the person had changed, only the surface in front of them. Overthinking often works this way. The mind assumes confusion means something is wrong with what it's looking at. It forgets to check the lens. The person wiped another section of the mirror, then another. Each pass revealed more detail. The face looked the same, but the image felt more trustworthy, less questionable. There was a quiet satisfaction in that. Not because the reflection was important, but because clarity didn't require effortful thinking. It required a simple action. The person paused, towel resting against the sink. The thoughts from earlier still lingered, but they felt less urgent now. less personal. Maybe nothing was wrong with the situation. Maybe the view had just been clouded. The mirror wasn't broken. It was dusty. The person turned on the faucet, briefly rinsing the towel. The sound of water filled the room, steady and grounding. As the towel was wrung out, droplets fell into the sink, each one landing and disappearing without leaving a trace. That felt familiar too. The person returned to the mirror, wiping the remaining areas, slowly, not rushing. The strokes were uneven, imperfect, but effective. The image sharpened bit by bit. Overthinking tends to pile up quietly. A doubt here, a second guess there. Each one settles like dust, barely noticeable at first. Over time, the surface becomes less clear, and the mind assumes the blur is permanent. But dust isn't damage. The person stepped back and looked at the mirror again. It wasn't spotless. A few streaks remained. But it was clear enough. The reflection felt stable. The person studied their own eyes for a moment. Not critically, just observing. The face looked tired, but familiar, real. The doubts from earlier returned briefly, testing the space. What if you're still missing something? The thought arrived, then softened. Even a clean mirror doesn't show everything at once. It shows what's in front of it. Nothing more. The person placed the towel back on the rack and turned off the light above the sink. The room dimmed slightly, shadows smoothing the edges of things. Clarity didn't mean certainty. It meant fewer distortions. The person leaned against the counter, letting the body rest. The mind felt quieter now. Not because the questions were answered, but because they no longer felt so close to the face. Distance helped. The mirror stood there, calm and neutral, ready to reflect whatever came next. It didn't judge. It didn't analyze. It simply showed what was there when it was allowed to be clean enough. And for now, that was sufficient. The bathroom felt quieter after the light was turned off. Only the small night light near the floor remained on, casting a soft glow across the tiles. The mirror reflected less now, but what it did show felt gentler, less exposed. The person stayed there for a moment, not checking their reflection again, just standing with hands resting on the counter. The surface was cool and solid, something real to lean on. The doubts from earlier in the day tried to return, but they came more slowly now. They didn't rush in all at once. They appeared one by one, like dust settling after the air has already begun to clear. What if I judged that wrong? What if I misunderstood someone's tone? What if I'm not as capable as I think? Each thought arrived, hovered, then passed without being pulled closer. The person noticed the difference. Earlier, these thoughts had felt right up against the face, demanding attention. Now they stayed at a distance. The mirror had helped with that, not by answering anything, but by changing how close the questions felt. Overthinking often presses the mind too close to the problem, so close that everything looks distorted. Small details feel huge. Uncertainty feels like failure. Stepping back doesn't remove the question. It restores proportion. The person turned slightly and caught a partial reflection in the mirror from the side. It wasn't sharp, but it was recognizable. Enough to know who was standing there. That seemed important. Clarity doesn't mean perfect visibility. It means not mistaking blur for truth. The person left the bathroom and walked down the hallway. The house was quiet now. Lights were low. The day had finally reached its end. In the bedroom, a lamp cast a warm circle onto the wall. The person sat on the edge of the bed and took off their shoes slowly, one at a time. Each movement felt unhurried. The mind continued to offer thoughts, but they felt thinner, less convincing, like reflections seen through glass rather than direct experience. The person remembered how earlier the mirror had looked dull, almost unreliable. Nothing about the person had changed during that time, only the layer in between. So many worries work like that. They don't reflect reality as it is. They reflect it through layers of doubt, fatigue, memory, and habit. The mind forgets that the surface can be cleaned. The person lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Shadows from the lamp softened the corners of the room. The body felt heavier now, not from tension, but from tiredness. A final thought drifted through quieter than the rest. Maybe I don't need to look so closely tonight. That thought didn't ask for agreement. It simply passed like a suggestion offered without pressure. The mirror in the bathroom would gather dust again. Steam would rise. Water spots would return. That was normal. Cleaning it once didn't mean it would stay clear forever. But knowing it could be cleaned changed something. The person closed their eyes, letting the day sit where it was. No need to recheck, no need to review. Some days require action. Some days require clarity. And some days only require not mistaking dust for damage. The room remained still. The thoughts grew softer, then fewer. And in that quiet, the mind rested, not because everything was resolved, but because the view no longer felt distorted. That was enough for tonight. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. I am rooted to this moment like an ancient mountain. I am rooted to this moment like an ancient mountain. I am rooted to this moment like an ancient mountain. My body feels heavy and solid, like warm stone. My body feels heavy and solid like warm stone. My body feels heavy and solid like warm stone. The winds of thought blow around me, but I remain unmoved. The winds of thought blow around me, but I remain unmoved. The winds of thought blow around me, but I remain unmoved. I possess the silent strength of the earth. I possess the silent strength of the earth. I possess the silent strength of the earth. My stillness is ancient and deep. My stillness is ancient and deep. My stillness is ancient and deep. Stable and completely safe. Grounded, stable, and completely safe. I am grounded, stable, and completely safe. Like a mountain in winter, I am wrapping myself in a blanket of silence. Like a mountain in winter, I am wrapping myself in a blanket of silence. Like a mountain in winter, I am wrapping myself in a blanket of silence. I rest in the foundation of my own being. Rest in the foundation of my own being. Rest in the foundation of my own being. Breathing is slow and steady, like the seasons. My breathing is slow and steady like the seasons. My breathing is slow and steady like the seasons. Timeless as the rocks. It's timeless as the rocks. The earth supports me. I can let go of holding myself up. The earth supports me. I can let go of holding myself up. The earth supports me. I can let go of holding myself up. Sanctuary of stillness. Sanctuary of stillness. Sanctuary of stillness. External noise cannot shake my inner ground. External noise cannot shake my inner ground. External noise cannot shake my inner ground. Relaxation sinking into the earth. Relaxation sinking into the earth. Relaxation sinking into the earth.